Hi everyone, welcome to the August 31st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragonin. I'll be joined very shortly by my usual co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're taking a look back at last weekend's racing, primarily focusing on the Saratoga card because it was Travers Day this past Saturday, and the big race did not disappoint. A really exciting duel to the wire with Essential Quality getting the better of Midnight Bourbon. We'll talk about that race in depth along with all of the other graded stakes action that took place last Saturday at Saratoga, all 6 grade 1s, and there were plenty of memorable performances on that card. We'll also mention some of the surrounding days at Saratoga. There were some notable efforts from some other days, other stakes races, also a 2-year-old maiden that attracted a lot of attention on the Saturday card. Then we'll move on towards the end of the podcast to talk about some races from Del Mar, including the Pat O'Brien and the return of Medina Spirit in the Shared Belief, and we'll finish things up at Charlestown, where Craig visited this past weekend with the Charlestown Classic. But Craig, a lot to dive into and some really exciting performances turned in on Saturday at Saratoga.
Yeah, that was a really fun day of racing. I was back home in Baltimore that day, but watching every chance I get and watching and wagering, we were kind of traveling around Baltimore, but I had my phone glued to my ear and my eyes at all times, taking in the races. And yeah, it's not often that you get a card that looks that great on paper and actually delivers from start to finish, but I don't think anybody could have a complaint about the Travers card.
Let's start with that big race, the Midsummer Derby, and Essential Quality just gets it done again. He grinds away at his foes. It just seems to have a nose for the wire, but this was a very unconventional race shape. You don't typically see grade 1 races, especially on the dirt, go this slowly through the opening fractions and feature the kind of sprint for home that we saw over the last quarter mile.
Yeah, this actually looked like a turf race. I had saw your comment about the time of the last quarter on Twitter. I think it was 28 or 23:15 for the race, which means Essential Quality probably did it a little bit quicker because he was a little bit behind turning into the stretch. And so I pulled up my database of all the 10 furlong races and did a quick query on the dirt. And this was by far the fastest finishing quarter. I don't think anything else was even close. I think I saw maybe a 23:50 was next. So it says a lot about the stamina of the winner, but also how slow the pace was. I mean, all the horses were flying home. A lot of them had really quick times. So it was just an odd race shape. It kind of set up that way on paper. You alluded to it on the forecast that it looked like Midnight Bourbon was going to be clear. And I think the decisive move in here was Luis Saez just keeping him within shouting distance. If you'd asked me before the race if he'd have been sitting second early, I probably would have said no, but he was able to do it, and that was all the difference. He was only able to get up and win by a neck, but personally, I would say if Midnight Bourbon didn't beat him that day, he's probably never beating him. Essential Quality just is a very good horse.
No, and you alluded to it. The thing that makes Essential Quality so dangerous is that he doesn't have a set running style. They can really put him wherever they want to. I mean, we saw them do this in the Bluegrass, where the main horse to beat was highly motivated, and they stuck Essential Quality right off that one's hip for the entire race, and he was able to run him down in the stretch. But he's also been successful coming from much farther back in the pack. I mean, I think of last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile, when they kind of went crazy on the front end. He came from much farther back to get the job done there. When you've got a dirt horse that has that kind of versatility, it really makes them difficult to beat because they can adapt to almost any race shape. And I know that the TimeformUS speed figure came back only a 122. That's knocked down a bit from the final time number of 126. This, though, is the kind of dirt race, because it's so unconventional and we rarely see it, where they come home so quickly, as you said, like a turf race. I don't think that the TimeformUS speed figure is kind of taking away from the number that the top two earned. It really is an accurate representation of the performance. I would go, from a handicapping standpoint, more off the 126 final time number in this case, because it does, like you said, it does take a lot of speed and stamina to come home as quickly as these two horses did. I was looking at the Trackist numbers, which I find to be pretty reliable when you're, talking about a dirt race at Saratoga, and they have Essential Quality coming home the final quarter in 22.95 seconds, making up about a length on Midnight Bourbon. That's just something you almost never see on the dirt. And like you said, the slow pace did contribute to his ability to do that, but he is a really cool horse to be able to run in, a fast quarter at so many different points in the race, depending on how the race shape unfolds.
Yeah, and I do want a couple points I want to make. I saw you ask, would it get the P notation? In this case, it didn't, because if I were to upgrade this race to where Essential Quality and Midnight Bourbon got figures to kind of match that final time of 126, it would just have the rest of the field running basically big lifetime tops, or at least the 3, 4, 5 finishers. And I thought this was a better representation, but I'm with you in this case. I think this was more like a 126 kind of race, which is very good for a 3-year-old and kind of matches what Essential Quality had run when he won the Belmont. The other thing I wanted to mention, this is a day we have coded in bright red as being very speed favoring. But personally, I now, like I said, I was kind of watching on the phone and in between races, but I didn't really find this to be a speed favoring track. I just think it was a case where a lot of the best horses happened to be fast and were getting inside position. But curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was going to make the exact same comment. I noticed that red notation. I thought it was very similar to the track that we saw at Saratoga on Friday. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the one thing I might say about it is that you didn't see a whole lot of horses running through the kickback, but you did in some races where the paces were fast. We'll get to the personal lines in a little bit. And the horses that won the races generally were speed horses. But like you said, they were logical horses. And while some did survive fast paces, they were generally horses surviving fast paces that were superior to the rest of the fields. And I think that was captured in the wagering. So I was a little surprised to see the red notation. It's obviously worth following moving forward, but I think we saw some pretty logical results on Saturday. And the one thing I would want to say coming out of this race is, how do you assess Essential Quality moving forward into the fall as he's going to face older horses, whether they decide to race him one more time before the Breeders' Cup Classic or not? To me, I don't always think that the 3-year-olds look that formidable going up against the older horses, but this year, I guess with the exception of Nick's Go, who's achieved some really high speed figures for the same trainer, Brad Cox, Essential Quality looks like the kind of 3-year-old that could make his presence felt in a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Nick's Go, while he's been very impressive this year in a few of his starts and not so much in a couple others, I really have questions about him getting a mile and a quarter, particularly if there's some other speed in the race. Now, he does generally go fast and just keep going, but if I had to pick one right now, I'd prefer Essential Quality, even though his speed figures are a little lower. I love the versatility. He's still a 3-year-old, so he's still improving, and he just seems to do everything right.
Let's stick with the dirt races for now on that Saratoga Saturday card and move 2 races forward to the Grade 1 Personal Ensign. One of many races in a series of races on this card that were just so thrilling to watch in the moment. And Latruska, they did not make it easy on her in this race. I was a little bit surprised at how many other riders took shots at her in the first quarter mile trying to send their mounts into that clubhouse turn. It's what you want to see in these races where there's a big favorite. You don't want to see them just concede the lead and allow that horse to get off to a facile victory. You want to see them make them work a little bit, and that's what riders like the rider of Harvey's Law Goyle, Luis Saez, did. Daniel Centeno, the rider of Miss Marissa, did that. Even Jose Ortiz on Swiss Skydiver tried to come up inside of her, but Latruska asserted her speed in the early going, and when the closers came to her late, she asserted herself once again.
Yes, I mean, she's just the best female horse out there. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I would say this was probably her best race yet. She may have had a figure that was a point or two higher, but as you said, she faced a few challenges in this race. She went really fast early. All of our fractions are coded in red except for the opening quarter, I believe, and that was borderline. And she was able to just hold off some pretty good closers anyway. Bonnie South, Royal Flag, and Dunbar Road had all run some nice races pretty recently, and they just couldn't quite get to her. So I'm not sure who's going to be able to beat this filly at this point. I can't remember if she's 5 and a mare or still 4. I think maybe she is a mare now. But yeah, this was impressive. This may have been the best race of the day from a individual performance, but there are so many to talk about. The others ran fine. I would be a little careful of upgrading them too much because they came so close. Because if you were ever going to beat Latruska, it seems like this was the day, and the closers just couldn't get it done.
Yeah, I saw some people saying maybe Bonnie South was a little bit unlucky because she had to alter course slightly in the stretch, but I mean, she had so much go her way prior to that with a fast pace up front. She was able to come through inside, saving ground on the turn, whereas Dunbar Road, who was narrowly beaten for second, finishing fourth, she had to come extremely wide at the top of the stretch. And, if there was just one closer running at Latruska late and Latruska held them off, maybe you could say, okay, well, I guess that closer hung. But I don't think all three closers hung in the late stages of this race. Latruska just found another gear and battled back. And I was looking at the TimeformUS pace figures for this race, and those that were up close with Latruska early, getting those TimeformUS pace figures of 140 or above at the first call, basically the horses that were fifth or better for the first two calls. You look at their pace figure drop off for the last call, and all of them are dropping off by 18 points or more from the penultimate call to the final call. And Latruska's only dropping off by 7 points at the end, which just kind of shows you that she rebroke basically the final eighth of a mile to hold off those horses. And I was watching the race, even on the gallop out, she ran away from those closers. They never passed her at any point. She just has so much grit and determination to her. And it's just amazing that even in, I think, the 21st start of her career, it's as if she just keeps getting better. And as you said, it's hard to see anybody beating her in the Breeders' Cup Distaff at this point. We'll see if she can hold her form until then.
Yeah, and I would say the one disappointment in the race has to be Swiss Skydiver. She just doesn't seem to be the same filly this year to me. She came back from winning. I forget which race it was back in October. Didn't run well in the Breeders' Cup, but she debuted with a win, and she just hasn't been the same since. She had run some pretty big figures last year. She really isn't improving on those. When I was watching the race, I was a little disappointed. I mean, she broke so well. I thought she was really going to battle for the front, but Jose Ortiz kind of eased her back out of there. And in the end, she just didn't run, so I don't think it mattered a whole bunch.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a problem with the ride Jose gave her. I thought he did what he was supposed to do. He sent her. Latruska is obviously just a little bit faster, and I don't think he wanted to get in a duel with Latruska through about the first half mile of the race, because he would have probably finished at the back of the pack where a horse like Miss Marissa did. She just didn't have it at the end. She doesn't have the finish that she's possessed in some of her races last year. So hopefully they could figure her out, but it seems like maybe she's just not the same horse that she was as a 3-year-old. Let's move on to some of those 7 furlong races. They ran 3 of them in a row on this Saturday card. And the most exciting for me to watch, and perhaps the most exciting race that I've seen all year, was the H. Allen Jerkins for the 3-year-olds. This one looked like it was going to be a real fun matchup on paper, and it delivered on the racetrack as Jackie's Warrior and Life is Good. They just threw it down. They went fast every step of the way. And Jackie's Warrior, he's a brilliant horse, but he's the kind of speed horse that they never make it easy on him, and he's able to overcome those unfavorable pace scenarios to get these victories. He's just such a cool horse to watch.
Yeah, he is so fast, and both the top 2 just ran so well in here. I'm not sure what to make. I'd like to hear when I'm done your comments on Life is Good of the trip being so wide all the way around, but that's how he always runs. But the pace was so quick, he actually got a better figure in here. They both got huge numbers. Jackie's Warrior, a 132. Life is Good, a 135, running just super fast early, 150 pace figures, which isn't easy to do, going just 7 furlongs. And this one certainly lived up to the billing. Personally, I saw Mike Smith getting a lot of grief and getting roasted for his ride. I'm just not sure what to make of it. I'm not ready to harass the guy so much about it, because I think the horse was given everything he had. If you think maybe he should have started moving a little earlier, I guess I can get it. But in the end, I think the better horse on this day just won the race.
I didn't get that conversation about Mike Smith. I tweeted something to that effect. That's just nonsense to me, this idea that Mike Smith, some were saying intentionally blew the race, some were saying just wasn't as strong a finisher as Joel Rosario. I mean, have you never watched Life is Good run before? Because I feel like a lot of these people making these comments probably haven't. This is just a free-running horse. He's naturally fast, and if you watch his prior races, he's got a tendency to drift out. He's not one of these horses that you can stick on the rail like Calvin Burrell and make him stay there. He is a horse that has a tendency to want to run out in the middle middle of the racetrack. And also, he's just runs fast on his own. Mike Smith and his prior rides on him has never really put him to a hard drive. He's just all hands and heels, and the horse does it himself. So when you're riding a free-running horse like that can be a bit of a runoff type, you want to just keep your hands quiet and let him do his own thing, and the horse will basically run his race. And also, when your main competition is another front runner, it typically is an advantage to be out in the center of the track and make that other front runner come through inside of you, because most times it's discouraging for a horse that's a need the lead type to have to come through inside of another speed horse. And that's what Mike Smith made Jackie's Warrior have to do in this race. And it's a credit to Jackie's Warrior that he dropped back a little bit, was under a ride inside of that horse the entire way, and still was able to come through for the victory. I just think that is a feather in the cap of Jackie's Warrior that he was able to do that. And I don't get this nonsense that if Mike Smith had been flailing away with the whip in the final eighth of a mile that he would have beaten that horse. I think we've seen enough evidence just from watching the races at Monmouth to suggest that, flailing away with the whip on a horse doesn't necessarily make them run faster. Every horse is a unique individual, and Life is Good clearly is not one that needs that kind of encouragement. And he got a 135 TimeformUS speed figure as it is. I don't think he was about to run a 140 if he had been whipped a few more times. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. You made a lot of good points there. I just didn't get the bashing of Mike Smith watching the race. And I actually watched it again to see if I thought I was missing anything. And I don't. And it comes down to, have you seen Life is Good run before? Because we've seen that same race from him. It will be interesting to see where these two go in the future. I assume Jackie's Warrior is going to stick to sprinting. I can't imagine they would want to try two turns. And at this point, he's got to be the Breeders' Cup Sprint favorite. I haven't heard on Life is Good. I would imagine they want to stretch him out. He doesn't look like the kind of horse that wants a classic distance to me, so maybe he's more a dirt mile type. But it'll be interesting to see where Todd Pletcher puts him next time out. As for the others, I think Following Sea showed that he is probably a sprinter more than a route horse, but he's got many lengths to make up to get up to these two.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like you, I'm really interested to see where these two go in the future. I think at this point, even though he's just a 3-year-old, we probably do have to consider Jackie's Warrior the leading contender for the Breeders' Cup Sprint at this point. I mean, we haven't seen any other horses in this sprint division consistently posting speed figures, TimeformUS speed figures, right around that 130 mark, and he got a 132 in here. I don't know if we mentioned that, up from the 126 final time number, because they did go so quickly on the front end. So I would consider him the leading contender for that race later in the year. And Life is Good, I don't know what they're going to do. Maybe a race like the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile will be on the horizon. They've talked about stretching him out. Maybe in a race like the Pennsylvania Derby, they definitely have some options with him. But yeah, I'll definitely be interested to see what path they take with both of these horses. Let's move on to another one of those 7 furlong races for the older horses, the Grade 1 Forego. And I don't know if it was exciting in the same way that the Alan Jerkins and the Personal Ensign were, but boy, was this kind of a nail biter down to the wire, as Firenze Fire literally tried to take a bite out of Yaupon.
Tried to take several bites. Just when you think you've seen it all in horse racing, something happens that surprises you. I mean, I've seen horses attempt to be savage plenty of times in my life, but not so persistently as Firenze Fire was trying to do to Yaupon here. And it may very well have cost him the race. I certainly wouldn't argue with anyone that tried to tell me that, because he certainly seemed to have the momentum and looked like he was going to go by. And once he got himself straightened out and stopped trying to bite him, he was gaining ground again. So impossible to say for sure, but these two were clearly best. I mean, they were well ahead of the field. It was one of those races where all the fractions are in blue. It was a really slow pace, but that was no real surprise. It kind of looked that way on paper and played out that way. And it was basically a match race from the start with nobody else making a dent. The final time figure was a 122 for the race. It was one of those, again, where it's downgraded to a 118. Say which will, I would probably lean towards more like a 122, but it's just one of those where, again, the majority of the field would probably be overrated if we made that pace adjustment in here.
Yeah, I mean, like what you were saying, I've seen some savaging attempts in the past, not often, but every once in a while. I mean, Firenze Fire, as many pointed out on social media, was the victim of one at Parks about 3 years ago when Where She Told Me to Go tried to take a bite out of him. But that was just a quick split-second thing that you'd miss if you blinked. But this time, Firenze Fire was persistent. I mean, for a good 10 to 15 strides, he was trying to take a bite out of Yopon in this race. I've never seen anything like that. And he almost won the race, like you said, and I agree with you. If he hadn't done that, he probably was going to win, because at the time of the incident, it seemed like he had just a little bit more to give. So an exciting race to watch. A perplexing race. I mean, I think we'll all be interested to see what Firenze Fire does the next time that he runs. But, given the emergence of a 3-year-old like Jackie's Warrior, and even a horse that we're going to talk about in California a little bit later in this podcast, it feels like the horses that competed in this Forgo, they might be a little bit up against it by the time we get to the fall, because we've talked about how the familiar faces in this sprint division are running those speed figures right around 120, just a little bit below 120, and how if anybody steps up, they're going to be too good by the time they get to the Breeders' Cup Sprint in the fall. And it feels like these horses might be just a cup below the top ones in the division.
Yeah, before we close out this race, I think we have to mention Whitmore. He came out of the race with an injury, and I think I read he's going to be retired. But what a warrior he's been. So sad to see him go, but I hope he enjoys the rest of his life. I mean, this horse started 43 times. He ran in the Kentucky Derby. He won more than a third of his starts, racing mostly in the top classes of racing. Won $4.5 million. So I'll miss Whitmore in my annual treks to Oaklawn Park. He's been a staple for so long. It seems like he's been there forever.
No, I have great appreciation for Whitmore. We've talked about him a lot on this podcast. I know as handicappers, we picked against him more often than not, but that doesn't mean you don't appreciate a horse. And it's just been so cool to see him perform at a high level for so many years. So hopefully he, as a gelding, has a nice, happy retirement. Let's move on to the last of these 3 grade ones we're going to talk about that were run at 7 furlongs. Actually, chronologically, the first one that they ran, that was the grade 1 Ballerina. And Craig, independently, we both kind of tweeted the same thing after this race, and that was just meh. I mean, Gamine, she got it done. She's a fast racehorse, but we just haven't seen the kind of otherworldly performances that she was putting forth last year since she's returned as a 4-year-old this season. She's still winning these races, but she's not giving that impression that she's invincible anymore.
Yeah, it's just I keep waiting for somebody to step up. I just don't know who it is at this point. I guess I'd have to check the 3-year-old fillies, see if any of them are starting to maybe run better figures as we head towards the Breeders' Cup. But yeah, she's a horse who won the Breeders' Cup last year, Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint with a 130 plus TimeformUS speed figure, and she hasn't hit the 120 mark. Now, this was another race where there was no pace whatsoever. She did get a final time of 123. It's downgraded to a 119. She's the kind of, I just don't know what to make of her, but as a betting person, I'm going to bet that once she faces a stiffer challenge, that she may be in trouble here, but she just keeps winning. So I'm just not sure what to do with a horse like her. Maybe she's still got that big effort in the tank, but there's sometimes when visually you look at a race and you know the figure doesn't make sense, or I shouldn't say doesn't make sense, but it doesn't match what she was able to do. In this case, I think it was. It looked like she was running pretty all out. She won easy, but I just wasn't blown away.
No, I thought that this victory visually looked a lot like her Derby City Distaff when she got it done by a similar margin, but I mean, there were a few dicey moments on the turn where it looked like some others were ranging up alongside of her and still had horse, and she was able to pull it out at the end. And it's kind of weird in all of her races this year. She's run these races where she goes slow early, or I guess I should say is allowed to go slow early because there really isn't any pace to press her, and she's able to come home fast enough to beat these horses. But I do get the sense that if she was facing another speed horse, I mean, it could go one of two ways. As you said, maybe she would run a faster speed figure because she'd be pushed to do so. Or maybe if she has to run a faster opening quarter or half mile, she would be more vulnerable. And, you know, the first race that pops into my mind is Bella Sophia's Test from a few weeks ago. That 3-year-old filly that, I mean, she wasn't setting a blazing early pace, but she is a very naturally quick horse that I would have been interested to see what would happen if she were in this ballerina and could have pressed Gamine on the lead. And maybe we'll see that in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint in the fall. But Gamine has not had to face a worthy rival on the front end this year. So she's had some very soft trips. And, I don't know what to make of it. I'm not a big fan of this idea that horses can't run without Lasix. But, it would be irresponsible for me to ignore the fact that all of Gamine's races this year have come without Lasix, and all of her huge speed figures last year did come with Lasix. So I think that's just interesting to point out. She's also the poster child for some of those, positive tests that Bob Baffert got last year. So make of that what you will. I have no information about what's been going on with this horse lately, as nobody in the media really does. So we'll see what happens as they move on to the fall. But I visually have not seen the same horse that I saw last year.
Yeah, no argument from me there. And yeah, she's certainly a great horse. She's won 9 out of 10, but as I said, sometimes fillies just don't improve, or any horse for that matter. And she doesn't seem to be doing it to me. So it just depends on the matchup. I know neither one of us were itching to pick against her in this spot. But she just got the cupcake trip that we expected. And I look forward to seeing her get challenged a bit more.
Well, most of the top racing action took place on the dirt on Travers Day. There were a couple of turf-graded stakes to discuss. One of those was the Grade 1 Sword Dancer run right before the Travers, and we did get a fast pace in this one, even though we didn't get them in a few of the dirt races. You rarely see it going 1.5 miles on the turf, but there were a few riders that were hell-bent on getting to the front end, and none more so than Manny Franco on Channelmaker, who was hustling this horse for a good quarter mile coming out of the gate, making sure that he got to the front end. And unfortunately, I think that spelled defeat for both him and Tribhuvan under Flavien Prat, who I don't blame him for conceding the lead to Manny Franco, because we're not getting ahead of that guy going into the far turn. But both of them were unable to overcome that trip, and it really set it up for some horses coming from off the pace, especially Gufo, who just got a perfect ride from Joel Rosario.
He did, and as to the pace, I would say hats off to Manny Franco, because there's only one way Channelmaker was winning that race, and it was going to the front. It didn't work out in this case because there was another fast horse in here and they pushed each other, but I wish we'd see more of that in these turf races. Not that I expect horses to go on suicide missions, but ride your horse to its strengths and see what happens. Sometimes the field isn't going to fit what your horse can do, but I don't think either one lost anything in defeat. They just ran into each other. Sometimes that happens. Gufo finally got that big Grade 1 win. I don't think he had one previously. He ran a 126 Timeform US speed figure. And I think, as you said here, the story was the ride. Japan, who finished a neck behind him in second, definitely ran into some trouble. He kind of didn't have anywhere to go. And once he got out, he was definitely flying at the finish. But I don't think it was so much a bad ride or anything like that by Ryan Moore. Joel Rosario gave this horse a perfect trip, was able to keep him penned in, get that first run, which is often so important in turf races because, when you're sprinting home, you don't want to have your run impeded, and he let the horse do what he does best. And Gufo grew up a bit, too. I think the blinkers have really made a difference with this horse, and he's a good one.
Yeah, I agree with you. I didn't think Ryan Moore did anything wrong in this race per se. He saved more ground than Gufo, kind of sitting on the rail for most of the way, especially coming around that final turn. I think the thing that might have messed up Ryan Moore a little bit was that those two leaders did expend so much energy at the very beginning of this race, so they kind of came back maybe a little bit sooner than he really would have wanted them to at the quarter pole, those being Channelmaker and Tribhuvan, so he had to lose a little bit of momentum angling out around those horses, and Gufo, as you said, he did get the first run, and Rosario was able to keep in Ryan Moore at that critical juncture about the 3/16 pole. But, watching these horses come to the wire, I don't know, it seemed like Gufo maybe had a little bit more to give. I didn't necessarily think that Japan was gobbling up the ground like he was going to roll right on by if he didn't have that trouble. So, they both ran fine. I don't think that this race is going to scare off any potential European shippers for the Breeders' Cup Turf in the fall. I know that it got a nice 126 Timeform US speed figure, but these are not the most talented Grade 1 American horses that we've seen over the past several years. I think they still, at least Gufo has something to prove in this division.
Yeah, if one thing, Gufo might get overrated off of this race because he's not likely to see this kind of pace, particularly going the mile and a half that we saw here. It doesn't develop very often. I doubt you would see these two horses engage in that kind of duel again, given what happened. So Japan's a nice enough horse. It's so hard to tell with the turf who's actually Breeders' Cup turf who's actually going to show up. But this was a solid Grade 1 race. We haven't seen a lot of them on turf this year from the local horses. And Gufo proved he's at least probably the best of the Americans, but he does need things to go his way.
Yeah, there was one other graded stakes on this Travers Day card, the Grade 2 Ballston Spa on the turf earlier in the day for the fillies and mares. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one, Craig. I thought the winner, Viadera, got a great trip from Joel Rosario. She has gotten many great trips from Joel Rosario going back to last year, especially in that matriarch that she won at Del Mar, but not the fastest speed figure in the world. I had taken a shot with High Opinion, who Luis Saez did everything right trying to come up the rail. It just fell a nose short, but not the fastest Grade 2 event that we're going to see.
No, definitely under par for Grade 2 older fillies and mares. Just a 116 from Viadera. So this field looked a little weak on paper for the class. Viadera was 4-5 in here without running particularly fast. So I don't have a whole lot to add on this one either.
The one other race we do have to mention from that Saturday card was the second race of the day, that Travers Day maiden race for the 2-year-olds going 6 furlongs that we see just about every year on Travers Day. Typically some good 2-year-olds debut in this one, and we definitely saw one of those this year as Jack Christopher for Chad Brown, a chestnut colt by Munnings who the word was out about. I remember when I first got the PPs for this race and started to do my workout work for the morning line, I knew we could see something special because this horse had been showing a lot of speed in the morning, something you rarely see from the Chad Brown barn, and he delivered on the racetrack, winning this race by almost 9 lengths.
Yeah, that was quite the performance. I'm not a guy that watches as many workouts as you do, but I had watched this one and was pretty blown away. He just looked so professional in his works, in addition to being fast. And it certainly carried over to the racetrack. As you said, the word was out. He was bet down to even money. And he ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, which I'm going from the top of my head, but I do believe that's the fastest we've seen all year. That's the kind of number who, if he's able to stretch out, could certainly win a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. I imagine he'll have another start in between, maybe the Champagne, something like that. But this horse was super impressive in here and probably vaulted himself right. If he's not at the top of the division, he's really close to it.
Yeah, this performance reminded me a lot of when we saw Complexity win for this same barn, or I should say the same trainer, Chad Brown, a few years ago, and that horse obviously came out of his debut to win the Champagne, so we'll see if Jack Christopher can do the same. I know that he's likely to meet some other talented horses in the Champagne. We'll see what happens in the Hopeful. I know Todd Pletcher had that impressive 2-year-old from the prior week, My Prankster, who looks like he could be pointed towards the Champagne as well. This is a horse, Jack Christopher, when I look at his pedigree, I do think that he's more of a one-turn type, being by Munnings. The Dam is actually a half-sister to Street Boss. That sire who can get a versatile kind of runner, but really is more of like a one-turn miler type of sire, as he was a racehorse as well. So we'll see how far he ultimately wants to go, but for the time being, he definitely looks like a promising 2-year-old. And this is a race that I think you can go back and look at horses who are running back that were beaten in this race, particularly the 3rd-place finisher, Be Better for Todd Pletcher, a horse that I thought had been working really well coming into his debut also, and seems like one that has the pedigree to get route distances, so I would look for him when he shows up in a maiden race next time. Let's talk about a few more races from Saratoga on different days last week. Going all the way back to Wednesday, we saw Serve the King, Chad Brown trainee, win the Johns Call, going the extended distance of 1 mile and 5/8 on the turf. And I thought the story of this race was the ride that Irad Ortiz gave Serve the King, because it can be a difficult position when you've got a couple horses run off on the front end in a marathon race, kind of like those two did in the Sword Dancer, but even to a greater extent in this Johns Call, because Conviction Trade and the other horse whose name is escaping me now that he was dueling with on the front end really opened up a sizable advantage on the rest of the field. And Serve the King for a portion of this race was kind of in that no man's land in the 3rd position, and Irad kind of had to decide when to make his move, and I thought he was appropriately patient to get the job done.
Yeah, it was a well-timed ride. We do rate these races, and we generally don't rate races over a mile and a half. But when it's a stakes race, particularly at a big meet, I'll do the best I can. We gave Serve the King a 124 in here for the win. It's more like a class rating or than it is a speed figure because frankly there's just not a lot of races to compare it to, but I thought it was a good effort. Not sure where these kinds show up. I don't keep up with my marathon schedule, but it is a division I wish we'd get more races in because they're really popular over in Europe, and you do seem to get a lot of horses that stick around for a while, so I hope this division will kind of take off here in the States.
Yeah, and this one got a similar figure to what the Sword Dancer got, which I think probably says more about the Sword Dancer than it does this race. I mean, Surf the King, he's coming out of a good fourth place finish in the United Nations in his prior start, but I know that in the Chad Brown barn, he's never been considered to be that high up in the pecking order, so maybe he's just coming into his own now as a 4-year-old, but he definitely has some more to prove. On to a couple of races from that New York bred showcase card that they ran on Friday. I think there were 6 stakes in total. We're going to talk about 2 of them. The one that got the best speed figure on the day was the West Point for the older males going a mile and the 16th on the turf. And, you know, Craig, we talked a little bit about aggressive tactics, and I think we saw quite a bit of that in this race. And looking at the dialogue on Twitter after this race was finished being run, I almost felt like I was in the Twilight Zone because all people do is complain about how there's no pace in New York, that these are merry-go-round races, and some connections finally decide to change it up and use their horses aggressively, and people are outraged. I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't get it. And that's kind of why I brought up the sword dancer piece. That's what you want to see. Do what your horse does best. Sometimes it's going to work out, sometimes not. And I've got no problem with these horses going early. I mean, Rinaldi's a front runner. Microsecond, certainly a horse who likes to be on or near the front. And contrary to popular belief, a lot of times when you have these speed duels, the speed horses still do just fine. They separate from the closers, kind of sap their kick. It didn't happen in this case. City Man kind of fell into almost a perfect trip. Credit to Joel Rosario, who seems to, we're mentioning him a lot this weekend. He had quite the big weekend at Saratoga, winning a lot of big races. But you know, it's what's going to happen. And I'm with you. I'm all for the red fractions and the fast paces because in the end, I think they're more honest races. The best horse generally tends to win more. Occasionally, you will get speed horses burned out. Maybe they were best, but I'd much rather see this in races where we get these 25 and 26 quarters and 50 halves because they just put me to sleep. And a lot of times, they're just kind of fraudulent results where the best horses aren't winning.
And I mean, I get it with Rinaldi. I mean, H. James Bond, as far as I can tell, is a trainer that a lot of people like to root for. It just seems like a really good guy, somebody with a small stable that does an honest job. So you want to see his horses do well. And he got some redemption a little bit later in the race for the Fillies and Mares with Jocosa, one we're not going to talk about, but she did run very well to win that race. But I mean, you know, even though you like the connections, it doesn't mean that horses like Rinaldi have to constantly be gifted easy leads and soft paces. And that's what had been happening with Rinaldi. I mean, he'd been finding himself in so many races where there were no other front runners, gets to control on the front end. And as you said, they're not races that are honestly run because the other horses that are in behind, they don't have a fair chance. Other riders on speed horses just seem to be conceding the lead to Rinaldi. So, I mean, in some sense, he kind of had it coming that he was going to face a more competitive pace scenario. And, you know, say what you will about Todd Pletcher and Mike Rapoli using team tactics in this race, which I think it's fairly apparent they were trying to do, sending microsecond while also having Mo ready in the race with one of the two looking like more of a contender than the other one. And I guess you could say microsecond was a little bit sacrificed, but I mean, all of this nonsense about how nobody has the right to challenge Rinaldi on the front end, I just don't understand it. I mean, if you want to see boring racing where frontrunners continue to go wire to wire, then have at it. But I want to see more rabbits and pacemakers.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, you could call it team tactics. It's not like Mo Reddy was back in last. I mean, he was sitting in third and he ran terribly because he was up too close to that fast pace too. So yeah, I've got no problems. Like I said, give me the red fractions. They make my job easier as a figure maker because you tend to get results that make a lot more sense, particularly on turf. So, yeah, no problem. Like I said, give me fast paces.
One other race to discuss from that New York bred card was the Albany, run right after the West Point. This one going 9 furlongs on the dirt. And I think we've got a couple of talented New York bred 3-year-olds here, especially the winner, American Revolution, who seems like the kind of runner for Todd Pletcher that might be able to tackle open company down the line, because this was a fast speed figure for the New York breds.
Yeah, he got a 118 for the win. He's now won 3 in a row, 3 of his 4. He's improved his speed figure every single time. He had won by 7 lengths last time at Finger Lakes. I guess it was a New York Derby. Got a 105 that day and a big jump up to a 118. So he's not too far from being able to compete in graded stakes and open company. Now, there are some lucrative opportunities with New York bred, so who knows what they're going to do, if they're going to give it a try or not. He's still a colt, though, so maybe it would. He's certainly well bred and showed plenty of ability on Friday.
Yeah, it seems like as we get towards the end of the summer, we've got a lot of these talented 3-year-olds kind of asserting themselves in slightly lesser races coming out of the woodwork, and they could really spice things up coming into the fall for races like the Pennsylvania Derby or some of those races where 3-year-olds tackle older horses. And we saw another one on Sunday at Saratoga in an allowance race going 6.5 furlongs, the 8th race. Bo Liam, who's now 3 for 3 in his career, and he's run some flashy speed figures each and every time.
Yeah, this was a race I was actually on a plane, didn't get to see it at the time, and I saw some of the Twitter talk. People were saying it was going to rival Jackie's Warrior. Well, it wasn't quite that quick, not even close, really. It got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure, which matches what he did in his debut at Churchill back in Derby week. It was a big effort, no knock. Steve Asmussen seems to be taking his time with him. It's a minor miracle he was able to find a non-winners of 1 and a non-winners of 2 for him. That's not always easy to do these days. But I would imagine that Stakes Company has got to be on the horizon now. I'm not sure how fast this horse is. Maybe he could have gone a little bit faster, but there's certainly nothing shabby about a 121. That would have won a lot of stakes races we've seen this year, including the graded kind.
No, I mean, for a 3-year-old to run these kind of numbers in all 3 starts, I think that is noteworthy, and he is going to have to step up if they have grade 1 aspirations for him in the future. But I like that Steve Asmussen is taking it a little bit slowly with him, and I think he's got the liberty to do that because he has some other very talented 3-year-olds in his barn, particularly Jackie's Warrior, who I would imagine he does not want Bo Liam to tangle with anytime soon. And they've kind of alluded to the fact that they're looking towards some mile races for Bo Liam. I think they mentioned stretching him out in the at Churchill Downs next, and he's the kind of horse that I could see them pointing to a race like the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, kind of maybe ducking some of the top 3-year-olds we see in the Sprint and the Classic, and I think that's a realistic goal for a horse that started his career off in such impressive fashion.
Yeah, and the way he runs indicates he's not a die-hard front runner that just goes fast and kind of hangs on at the end. His running lines have shown he ran very evenly in this one. The pace figures have went they were even throughout the race. In his prior race when he drew inside and he had to use that speed, he went pretty quick. But in his debut, he had actually kind of went slow, rated off the pace, and finished really fast. So he is a horse to me that, if I had to guess, looks like he could handle more distance.
Yeah, you make a good point about him. He's not one of these horses that takes you there on his own like a Life is Good per se. And when you watch this race coming to the top of the stretch, you almost doubted that he could draw off by 6 lengths because it seemed like Ricardo Santana was already asking him by that point. But he is one of those horses that the more you ask, the more that he gives. And I could almost see why he went off at a decent price in his debut, because he just doesn't seem to be that flashy in his morning training or in the afternoons. But he can run pretty fast when he's asked to do so, and he has in all 3 starts so far. So we'll see what he can do when he steps up against Stakes Company in the future. Another 3-year-old that put in a workmanlike performance as we shift gears and move out to California to Del Mar was the Kentucky Derby first place finisher, I think it's okay to say that, Medina Spirit, who returned in the Shared Belief this past Sunday. And, it's hard to talk about this horse without mentioning the fact that he did test positive, an overage for a controlled substance in the Kentucky Derby. I think we have to state that right off the bat. And he came back after that and was 3rd in the Preakness, and we haven't seen him since then. So a lot of eyes were curious to see what would happen with him as he returned in this Shared Belief. And I mean, he showed up as, I think, the same old Medina Spirit. He put in his typical gritty performance.
Yeah, he did. He looked like he was being challenged, and in the stretch, he was able to dig in. I don't have the official speed figure yet. My guess is it's going to be about a 121, which is only a point off of what he ran in the Derby. It's hard to say how, if he was fully cranked up or not for this, because you'd like to see a horse like him moving forward from that Derby. I mean, he is a 3-year old, and that race was over 3 months ago, going on 4 months. So maybe he's got more in the tank. He's kind of an enigma right now, as you say. I mean, he is, I guess, officially still the Kentucky Derby winner. Who knows when they're going to get around to that? But it was a solid enough effort. Personally, I was a little worried Rock Your World might have been toast after getting thrown to the Wolves a couple times in the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont. But he came back and ran pretty well. He's probably going to be near that 120 mark. So solid return for him, but they definitely got some room to go if they're going to jump back into the big pool with the top 3-year-olds.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice starting point for both of these horses if they're going to take on a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic eventually. I assume that's the goal right now with both of these runners. And, Medina Spirit didn't figure to be at his best either off the layoff or going a flat mile. I mean, he did run his best career race going 1.25 miles, so you would assume he'll get better from here. And I liked the way that he did it visually. I was kind of mentioning this on Twitter that, I mean, it's rare to see a horse that appears to be all in running with his ears pricked. I mean, the one horse that I could remember doing that consistently was Zenyatta, who just would always run, even when it seemed like she was sprinting, with her ears kind of pricked forward, ahead of her rather than behind. And Medina Spirit kind of has that same way of going, where it almost looks like he's goofing off a little bit, but he still gets the job done. So we'll see what he does when he gets a real challenge from some tougher horses in the future. But I mean, just under normal circumstances, this would be a good return that he can build on. But, obviously, there's a lot of skepticism about what we're going to get from this horse in the future, given all that went on with him in the spring. So we'll be watching curiously to see what goes on with Medina Spirit in subsequent starts.
Yeah, and I should say the pace was pretty moderate. It won't be to the point where it gets blue fractions, but the pace figures were getting faster and faster all the way up to like a 123 final time number.
Now, Craig, we have been talking for months and months, really going all the way back to the end of last year, about how weak this sprint division was among the older horses, and feels like maybe the tides are starting to turn a little bit because we've had a few really impressive sprint performances over the past couple weeks, particularly this past weekend, and we saw another one of those at Del Mar in the Grade 2 Pat O'Brien, as Ginobili has sort of come out of nowhere to become the best sprinter in California.
Yeah, he was a horse who had shown a lot of talent as a 3-year-old, but he was really erratic. He would throw in some real duds and he would throw in some big races, but he threw in a huge race at a mile last time. He got a 128 TimeformUS speed figure for that win in just an allowance race, and it was really eye-popping. And this was a case where doing the speed figure work actually pays off, because he had a huge advantage on this field, and I think he backed it up on the racetrack. He didn't run quite as fast from a speed figure perspective. He got a 122, but he did it really, really easily. I thought he handled this field even more than the length and 3/4 margin would indicate. So definitely the best sprinter out west. Not sure if there's any 3-year-olds out there. I can't think any off the top of my head. Life is Good went east, so yeah, he would be the top of the division for me. He beat the usuals. We talked about the same old group out east. We had the same group out west with CZ Rocket, Flagstaff, and 8 Rings, just running their typical mid-teens type TimeformUS speed figures, and typically that's not good enough to win graded stakes races for older mares. Or older males. It has been earlier this year, but as you said, the tide's kind of turning and some horses are starting to step up.
Yeah, like you said, I think it was appropriate that he beat those two horses because they kind of are friends to speed figure makers, especially Flagstaff. They always run the same numbers, and sometimes it's good enough when they're not facing any really brilliant foes, but that wasn't the case here, as Ginobili has really emerged, as you said, with that impressive allowance victory back. And I mean, I'm not somebody that thinks that blinkers usually make a big difference on horses, but I think we've got 2 examples this week of horses that have just been completely reformed through blinker changes. I mean, one of them was Latruska, who has just taken her game to the next level since they took blinkers off. And the other one is Ginobili, who since they put the blinkers on, 2 back in that impressive allowance victory, he's just blossomed in a way that you never would have thought possible. And we'll see if he can turn his speed all the way back to 6 furlongs. I imagine they'll try that at Santa Anita in that race that used to be the ancient title, whose name I'm not remembering anymore. But he appears to have the speed to do it, and just a welcome new face in this California division.
Yeah, that would be the Santa Anita Sprint Championship. Very original name. But he's an interesting one for me because he did actually run fast around 2 turns. Granted, it was only a mile, but bordering on a mile and a 16th with the crazy long run up they have at Del Mar. So he's got some options as well. He's a horse who could be pointed for that Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile if things didn't work out in the ancient title. I would argue he might even be better at 7 furlongs to a mile, but we'll see. I'll be curious to see how he runs in that ancient title if that is in fact where he shows up.
Let's wrap up the Del Mar action with the discussion of a few notable 2-year-old performances from last week in maiden races, beginning with a couple on the Saturday card. We saw a filly debut for John Sadler named Electric Ride in the first race of the day, and we also saw Rockefeller for Bob Baffert a little bit later on. Different race shapes for both of these horses, one with a slower pace, one with a faster pace, but both of them did it the right way.
They did. Electric Ride only got a 92. It was downgraded a bit from a 99 final time figure, but did everything right. As you said, one off by 8.5 lengths. So certainly a talented filly in here. I do want to mention these Del Mar times because it's still GMAX as of this recording. They do all get recorded from video, and the difference in time wasn't quite what it will show. What the chart shows currently between this and the Rockefeller race, they were quite a bit closer. And what was the big difference was pace. This was just a much slower race than the Rockefeller one later. That's why she was downgraded so much.
Yeah, and I thought that the filly was pretty professional. She was able to rate on the lead and finish very nicely, but clearly Rockefeller, like you said, had much more pace pressure. He broke from the inside, had to be used quite a bit to maintain that position and put away the other speeds, and the race behind him was kind of dominated by closers, and when you watch them come through the stretch, Rockefeller was hanging on his left lead for the entire run through the lane, so he's one that definitely has room for improvement off this, and I just love this guy's pedigree because his dam, Dance to Bristol, was one of my favorite horses from the past 10 years or so. She was a mid-Atlantic runner that came to Saratoga a few times, a sprinter who I think raced 20 times and was in the exacta in 18 of 20 starts. Just a really cool horse for low-profile connections that won some big races, so it's nice to see her have a good foal. One other race from Del Mar that I wanted to mention from last week was a Friday maiden event going a mile around the 2 turns, and that was won by Oviatt Class, a horse who definitely got some help from the early pace because they blazed up front, but I liked the way that this one finished for Keith DeSormo.
Yeah, I think there were some clues to this when he debuted him going a mile on the turf, indicating maybe he wasn't the quickest type. Cut him back to 6 furlongs on the dirt, and he actually ran pretty well that day, and the stretch out was right up his alley. He improved his figure from an 84 to a 99, so he's definitely improving type for a trainer who doesn't fully crank them up early, kind of brings them along slowly. So I thought this was a good effort from him, first time 2 turns on the dirt.
Yeah, and he definitely is one that looks like longer distances are going to be to his benefit. The dam is a full sister, I believe, to Tiz a Hit, who won the Demoiselle, going a mile and an eighth when she was a 2-year-old. So there's definitely precocity and the ability to go long in this pedigree. And he's one that I would think they'll target the frontrunner next at Santa Anita, the race that used to be the Norfolk. The American Pharaoh. Frontrunner, then American Pharaoh. Keep forgetting they rename these races. But a mile and a 16th would be right up this one's alley, and all the other horses that I would imagine he'll face in that race will be coming out of sprints. So he's definitely one that looks like he could be formidable when they run in the American Pharaoh next time up. Craig, let's finish up this show by talking about the race that you saw live this past weekend, the Grade 2 Charlestown Classic at Charlestown on Friday night. What were your impressions of the race and the night overall?
It was a really good night. They put on a great show. Eric Zimney runs things there at Charlestown from the racing side, and it's not the Charlestown I went to as a kid. There was a really nice crowd there. There was a little rain mixed in early, but overall it was a really nice night. It's turned into quite a nice track. I actually usually when I go there, you kind of have to walk through the casino, which is nice in itself. But this kind of parked and came in on the clubhouse turn and never left the racetrack. And there were a lot of big races on the card. We're only going to talk about this one, but for our customers, I'd say look through the charts because there were some big efforts. In some of the other races, the Charlestown Oaks was a nice race. A couple of the listed stakes got some big figures, so worth looking at. But the highlight of the day was Art Collector, no doubt. He had won that Alydar Stakes at Saratoga last out, and this looked like a good spot. It was a big $800,000 purse. His 122 last out was a really good number for him. Now, deep down inside, even though I didn't bet him, I was rooting a little bit for Sleepy Eyes Todd through the stretch because it looked like those two they were clear of the field. Nobody was catching them, but he couldn't quite hold on. It was good to see that one get back to his best form, but just a big effort from Art Collector. He got a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, and it'll be curious to see if he can improve because that seems to be where he's topped out. But he's still a lightly raced 4-year-old, so maybe there's more in the tank.
Yeah, Sleepy Eyes Todd, a likable horse, one that had won this race in the past, but he was just second best on this day to Art Collector, who, like you said, has really kind of come back into form since being transferred to the Bill Mott barn. Did you think that the track was quite speed favoring on this day? I saw there was some chatter about that. I watched a few races. It seemed like horses that got to the front and also got to the inside were especially dangerous. I don't know if maybe that's typically the case at Charlestown, but it did seem like a pattern really emerged on this card.
Yeah, I did see a lot of chatter about that, but frankly, that's Charlestown most of the time. It's a small track. It's a 6 furlong track. The turns are tight. So, of course, saving ground and getting to the inside is always going to be an advantage. Yeah, it's mostly a lot of really good horses. Well, was it a little more speed favoring and inside speed favoring? Maybe, but nothing I would get too concerned about. I think it was a case of, yeah, if you swing wide on turns at Charlestown, you're doomed. I mean, it's always been that way for as long as I can remember, unless the pace just completely falls apart, the stretch is really short. So if you do swing wide, by the time you make your move, the race is almost over. So we don't have it coded as a bias day. I know that'll probably surprise some people, but it didn't really surprise me.
As for the winner, Art Collector, I think it remains to be seen where he really fits in this older horse division. I will say, regardless of whether you think the track was speed favoring or not, the fact remains that he's gotten very favorable pace setups, both in this race and in the Alydar prior to this. So we'll see what happens when he faces some tougher competition in the future. But it is nice to see him come back into form because he did look pretty promising when he was a 3-year-old.
Yeah, he did, and he really went kind of off the edge at the end of the year running 2 terrible races. So he's turned it around in Bill Mott's barn. Whatever he's done has definitely made a difference. I imagine graded stakes this was a graded stake at grade 2, but graded stakes on some of the bigger circuits are in his future, and I'll be curious to see how he does.
Well, that's all the racing to recap for this week. We will be back again later in the week to talk about some races for this upcoming weekend. Whether we focus on Saratoga or not, we'll have to talk about that a little bit, but there is a nice card coming up at Saratoga for the final weekend of their meet that includes the Jockey Club Gold Cup, the Flower Bowl. I think the Prioress and the Saranac are the other races carded for that day, so we'll see how they're arranged and whether there's an interesting sequence to talk about, but Craig and I will come back to do some handicapping for Friday's TimeformUS Forecast. Remember that you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to take a listen to that TimeformUS Forecast coming up on Friday.